Good morning to everyone online this morning. Good morning, Boker Tov, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for coming. I'm going to try this side. That's better. Okay. Okay, good morning to everyone. Shabbat Shalom. I hope everybody is well today. And to everybody watching online, good morning, Shabbat Shalom. I will endeavor to speak loud. We're fixing the lights, and I'll repeat all the questions. In fact, this morning I'm not even going to answer the questions. I'm just going to repeat them. So I'm going to fix the air conditioning, as is our custom. Asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu litaken et mezug avir umayim. It's my custom, I know. Okay, good morning. This morning, following our study, everyone is invited. We have service this morning, which is a lovely, as there's no bar mitzvah, just a nice davening. So as Herschel likes to say, it's a non-commercial davening this morning. Just say hello to God, and then a nice little kiddush afterwards. This coming week, of course, we're going to talk about this today. We're going to celebrate the 70th birthday of the State of Israel. It's a tremendous milestone in Jewish history. So I want you to know that this week we're going to spend the week in celebration. On Wednesday night, which is Erev Yom HaAtzmaut, we're going to do what we're calling a Tikkun Atzmaut. Just like you have a Tikkun Leil Shavuos, we'll do a Tikkun the night before Yom HaAtzmaut. And what we've done is invited, we're going to meet some of them today, the great Zionist fathers and mothers to come be here. So instead of me and the rabbis and guys, we have Theodore Herzl is coming. Ahad Am said he'd be here. Zev Jabotinsky, a little hard to get along with, but he said he's coming. Golda said she's coming and she's bringing cookies. And maybe David Ben-Gurion. So please come and join us. We're going to set up a Zionist roundtable and talk about the history of Zionism and the future of the State of Israel through the eyes of the great Zionist mothers and fathers, and they all said they're coming, so we'll have to see. That's this coming Wednesday night, 7:30, I think, in the Sherlopati Chapel, okay? And it wasn't easy to get them, you know. So Friday night, the Cantors are putting on a Farbrengen. At 7:30, we'll pray through the service. At 8 o'clock, we're going to have a sing-along of 7 decades of Israeli songs. So each decade, another song. And Noah Derry, who's a member of our staff, who's a former big television star in Israel, is going to join us to perform a lovely night of Jewish music, okay? Shabbos morning, we will gather as usual and have our Torah study in the morning. That Shabbos morning happens to be the 18th anniversary of the Neshama Minyan, of Nina's Minyan. And so the congregation is going to join the Neshama Minyan that morning for a celebration of that Minyan, and talk about the development of a woman's minyan and women's prayer. But so the whole synagogue will join them, and there's a special kiddush to celebrate that. And on Sunday, next Sunday, not tomorrow, but next Sunday, we will celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut together as a community beginning, I think it's at 11:30. We're going to have a day, it's for families, adults and families and kids, of celebration of Israel, of crafts and foods and culture and learning, all together. So please come and join us for that as well. Okay, to celebrate Israel's 70th year. And then next Sunday is also the Walk Against Genocide, put on by the Jewish World Watch. That's at the Pan Pacific. What's it called? Is it Pan Pacific Park? Yeah, it's where the Holocaust Museum is. And this year they're starting later. They're gathering at 9 and walking at 10. Usually it was earlier, but now it's so. That's the other way you can celebrate Israel Independence Day. Okay, those are all the announcements. Did I get them all right? Most of them right? Some of them right? We'll see what happens. So this time of Jewish year, 2 holidays. The holiday of Pesach celebrates our freedom, our liberation from bondage, from slavery. It celebrates a certain kind of freedom. It's freedom from restraint, from slavery, from bondage, from confinement. And then we count 7 weeks of the Omer, and we have the holiday of Shavuot. In the Torah, the holiday of Shavuot doesn't have a date. All the other holidays have dates, on the 1st of the 7th month, that's Rosh Hashanah. On the 10th of the 7th month, that's Yom Kippur. On the 14th is Sukkot. Pesach is on the 14th of Nisan. Come in. All the other holidays have dates, but this holiday, Shavuot, has no date. It says you begin from the Shabbat. Come in. You begin from the Shabbat, which the tradition understood as the first day of Yontiv. Count 7 weeks of weeks. 7 weeks. 7 days, 7 times 7. And on the 50th day, you celebrate the holiday of Shavuot. Now, again, in the Torah, the holiday of Shavuot is the holiday of bringing Bikurim, bringing first fruits of the land. It was the rabbinic tradition that added the idea that this is the day of the Torah's giving. So what we end up with is a wonderful set of holidays. Pesach, which celebrates the freedom from restraint, the freedom from slavery, freedom from bondage. And Shavuot, which celebrates freedom too. Freedom to become a holy people. Freedom to create a sacred society. Freedom to embrace the divine dream of covenant and make the world over in the image of God. So freedom from and freedom to make freedom complete. To have only half of freedom is not to be free. Right? You all know this if you have small kids. They wait for summer vacation. And they wait. And then on the day that school is out, there's this great celebration. And then 2 days later, the kid's moping around the house and says, "Mom, I'm bored." That's what happens when you have freedom from without freedom to. When you have freedom from restraint, freedom from confinement without a vision of what to do with that freedom, of how that freedom ought to be invested and used and developed. That's freedom from without freedom to. And the same thing happens in adult populations. When you take off the restraints, but you give people no vision of what to invest their freedom in, how to develop themselves under the conditions of freedom, what happens is either you have license, which means people go crazy, or more often you have a retreat from freedom. The Torah's idea that people keep saying, "I want to go back to Egypt because I don't like the insecurity of not knowing what tomorrow's going to bring. I'm scared of the insecurity of not knowing what tomorrow's going to look like." So these two holidays united together by the days of the Omer represent a complete vision of human freedom. And the 7 days of the Omer connect them. So far, so good? Then comes this generation. And this generation does something really interesting. We began talking about this last week. We insert 2 new holidays. Actually, 2.5, 3.5, if you count Yom Yerushalayim. 2 new holidays into this period between the two. Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut. Yom HaShoah, which commemorates the events, the horrors of the Holocaust. And Yom HaAtzmaut, which is the celebration of the independence of the State of Israel. These 2 remarkable moments. And to insert a holiday into a liturgical year means something. Because it means that you recognize that these events are not simply events of history. They're not simply, on this day in history. That in fact, these events change the way that we view the world. That they have a spiritual significance. That they change the way that we see ourselves. That they change the way that we see God in the world, acting in the world. And when you put them in this period of time, you're saying something really important. Because you've just celebrated Pesach, which is the principal holiday in which we embrace a God of history. A God who is not merely met in nature, but met in the events of history. When God speaks the 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus, what does God say? "I am the Lord your God who," it doesn't say created heaven and earth. That would be a God you meet in nature. But the problem is that nature has no morality. It rains on the fields of the evil as well as on the fields of the good. Right? Nature has no morality. In order to embrace a God of morality, you introduce a God of history. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." You meet God in the events of your history. And then you're going to meet God again 7 weeks later in the revelation of Torah. All right, but now comes the problem. In the midst of this celebration of a God of history, you introduce 2 holidays which profoundly shake up our notion of a God of history. You introduce Yom HaShoah. You introduce a holiday which commemorates the most horrific act of evil ever committed on this planet. And we're its victims. And it's completely contrary to Pesach. Because here you have a Pharaoh who is not met by 10 plagues. A Pharaoh who is not stopped in his genocidal ambitions. And how do you then embrace a God of history if you have this terrible stain on your memory? What does a God of history mean at this point? And then a week later, you go the exact opposite. You have Yom HaAtzmaut, and you say, oh, now I understand God and history. Here's redemption. Here is the modern arrival in Canaan. Here is redemption. And you have people say this, by the way, after the Six-Day War. Rav Kook, the great Rav Kook, the original Rav Kook, his son Yehuda, says this is the hand of God. Even Abraham Heschel said something similar. He said echoes of eternity. And you have the rise of a political movement which says if God is present in the resurrection of the state of Israel and its ambitions, then we have a right to the whole land. We introduced a new line into the liturgy. When you say Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, you say Harachaman, U'yivarech et Medinat Yisrael, bless the state of Israel, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. Reshit, the beginning, Tzmichat, of the flowering of Geulatenu, of our redemption. This is messianic. This is the beginning of messianic times. So you have a group of young Israelis who say, well, if this is the beginning of messianic times, we better further these ambitions. So let's go out to that land, that liberated land, and build Jewish settlements there, lest some secular government change their mind and give that back and reverse the process of redemption. And you have the whole Gush Emunim and the settler movement. It's very messianic. But the questions here are difficult. So you have a right, you have a license now to steal land from Arab landowners and burn their olive trees because you think this is the beginning of your liberation? Is that really what you're allowed to do? Right? And then on the other hand, beyond that, how do you then square that God of redemption with the events of the Shoah? So then you got to tell me how you read Auschwitz, if that's how you read Hebron, right? Or the West. You see by sticking these two holidays at this time of year, you raise this question of what does it mean to believe in a God of history at this moment of our history. And it's interesting, by the way, because what the community decided to do is not what you would have expected. We have had catastrophes in the past. You probably knew that. A lot of them. And what did we do with those catastrophes? What did we do with those moments of evil and exile and brokenness? We assimilated them all onto one day, somewhere innocuous in the middle of the summer, called Tisha B'Av, right? Not in prime time in April or May, but in the middle of August when no one's home, we have the holiday that commemorates all of the terrible things that happened to the Jewish people. I mean, the mythology of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is that on this day the first temple was destroyed, and the second temple was destroyed, and the Jews of Spain were exiled, and the. Well, the reason you tell that story is that what you're trying to do is not have a whole year populated by days of commemoration of terrible things. You want to stuff them all onto one summer afternoon. Fast, get it over with, and get back to the work of redemption. That's Tisha B'Av, right? And the mythology of Tisha B'Av is the story that's articulated in Deuteronomy that we read last week, and that's re-articulated by the biblical prophets, particularly Jeremiah. We were evil, we sinned, we broke our side of the covenant, and God punished us, which is why the rituals of Tisha B'Av are rituals of mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, because you are repenting the sins for which you were exiled. We fast, that's a mourning sign. We sit on the floor, we talk about our sinfulness. We aspire to be better. It's a whole process of tshuva, right? Now, comes to the Shoah, the community decided not to put Yom HaShoah on Tisha B'Av. And that's a sentence that takes some explaining, so just listen again. We decided not to put Yom HaShoah on Tisha B'Av. Why? Because we didn't want to use the traditional methods of interpretation, the traditional tools of absorbing catastrophe applied to the Shoah. Because it's one thing to say, as Jeremiah, the prophet, said, that Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, who's coming to destroy Jerusalem, is the rod of God's wrath against a sinful Jerusalem. Jeremiah said that. They put him in prison for saying it, but okay, he said it. Would anybody be willing to say that Hitler is the rod of God's wrath coming to punish a sinful Israel? That somehow Auschwitz was an expression of divine will? Some did. The very orthodox, the very that's the line, by the way, between reasonable religion and ludicrous religion. Okay? There's those who do really are outside the fringe. Because then you have to imagine all kinds of permutations, all kinds of twisting of logic, right? That somehow the SS is an instrument of God's will is a terrible thing. So the reason we put it on a different day is because we wanted to pull it out of that logic. Now, if you pull it out of that logic, what's left of that logic? So in 1960, a young rabbi, actually a classmate of Rabbi Schulweiss's by the name of Richard Rubinstein, publishes a book called After Auschwitz.
My teacher.
He was your teacher? A very, 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 very smart guy. And he writes in this essay, he says, because remember that the Holocaust did not become visible until 1967. There were very few Holocaust memorials, very few Holocaust commemorations, very few books, no movies, until after the Six-Day War. It was the Six-Day War that brought the Holocaust back to visibility. So what happened? Well, Eichmann to an extent in 61, so it's just even before that. And Rubinstein writes, he says, I don't see why no one's talking about this. And he writes, it's not really an essay, it's a scream. How can you go on teaching the same ideas about God, about theology, about the Jewish people in the world, in the face of this horrible evil? And Rubinstein says the only way that you can do it is if you try to assimilate the Holocaust into the structures of the Bible. You have to say that Hitler was punishing a sinful Israel. And he says, I can't believe this. And so what he does is he puts away, he says, I will no longer read Deuteronomy. I can't apply that history, that model of history, that model of a God of history to my own events. What he offers instead is something very difficult. He loves Camus. He loves existentialism. So he says, we live in this empty world. And I'd rather live in an empty, godless, absurd world than blame Jews for their own destruction. At least in an empty, godless world, I don't have to feel like it's my fault that I just got beat up. There's something heroic about that stance, living in an absurd world. And he says this isn't the end of religion, because religion is the tool that we have to take care of each other in the face of all the absurdity in which we live. It's a challenge to theology. And what happens in response is that post-Holocaust writing, post-Holocaust theology, including that of Rabbi Schulweiss, our dear friend, dear teacher, is really a response to Rubinstein. Schulweiss, working, I think, and in my biography I wrote that the motivation was he respected the question that Rubinstein was asking, but he didn't like the answer. And he didn't like the answer because he's a congregational rabbi. And as a congregational rabbi, he felt that you're not going to tell people they live in an absurd, dark, evil world because they're struggling to make meaning out of their lives. So what Schulweiss says is, I agree with him that I can no longer believe in a God of history, except this, that the God of history that I do believe in is a God who is expressed in human acts of responsibility. We are the hands of God, and we are the eyes of God, and we are the heart of God, and that's where I find God in the world. And there's no God outside of us who's casting frogs down on the Nazis. casting plagues on the Nazis. If there's going to be a God of history, it's because we take up the challenge to bring justice. That's Schulweiss's idea of godliness. But then he has to prove that it's real. Because if you say, well, that's nice, Rabbi, but that kind of human responsibility simply doesn't exist. I mean, it's occasional. Sometimes people do nice things, but most of the time people are pretty selfish. Just look around you. So Schulweiss goes looking for empirical evidence, factual, historical evidence of a God of history. And one day he's doing a dinner. He's the keynote speaker at a Federation dinner in San Francisco at a big hotel owned by Benjamin Swig, the philanthropist. And Swig says, I want you to meet somebody. And Swig introduces Schulweiss to Fritz Graebe, who is the maintenance supervisor of the hotel. And he says to Graebe, take a few minutes and tell the rabbi your story. Fritz Graebe is a German national. He was actually honored by the German government for service to the country. He was a contractor, construction contractor, under contract with the Nazis to build military installations in the Ukraine. And he watched the Nazis slaughter the Jews of town after town after town during the war. And Fritz Graebe's conscience was turned. And he decided that he would do something. What he started to do is he told the Nazis he needs laborers. He needs laborers. Why not take Jews? They're cheap, right? So he starts hiring Jews under Nazi contract. And the Jews that he's hiring are now protected from deportation. At one point he had 5,000 Jewish workers under contract. And then he realized that the Nazis started getting wise to him. So he would put teams of laborers on trains and send them across borders back and forth so the Nazis couldn't find where all of his laborers were. And when the Nazis finally caught on, which was close to the end of the war, Graebe left and crossed the lines, gave himself up to the Allies, ended up testifying at the Nuremberg trials against the people who did what the SS, and then he became an anathema. He became poison in his neighborhood. People, they broke his windows and hurt his kids, so that's why he moved from Germany to California. And Benjamin Swig hired him because he's a contractor, he's a great guy, to run the Fairmont Hotel. So Schulweiss, this young rabbi, says to Fritz Graebe, what did we ever do to thank you? You saved 5,000 Jewish lives? What did we ever do to thank you? And Graebe says, I don't need anybody to thank me. And that's where the foundation for the righteous was born. And that's where Schulweiss begins to think differently, because if I can find people who were willing to save Jews in the Holocaust, then the God of history lives. You see the connection? Schulweiss's obsession with Christian rescuers wasn't just a historical thing, an interest in history. It was part of his theology. He was trying to rescue God from Richard Rubinstein's attack, from the despair of the Holocaust. And if I can find God in human responsibility, and I can find human responsibility, human moral courage in the darkest of situations, then I can believe in a God of history. It still lives. Right? But then Schulweiss went one more step, which pissed everybody off. That's a technical term in theology. Because everyone was going around saying, right, never again. But Schulweiss recognized something very interesting in what we mean when we say never again about the Shoah. What we mean most of the time is never again to us. But Harold said, no, you can't say that. Because the God of history isn't just the God of the Jews. If you're going to believe in a God of history, you're going to have to believe in a God who liberates all humanity. So the Holocaust, the lesson of the Holocaust can't be never again to us. It means never again to anybody. And that means that we have to take responsibility for people in Darfur. For people in Darfur. And in every place else where there's genocide. And you remember, some of you were here, he got a lot of pushback for it because the Holocaust is ours. It's our tragedy. What do you mean sharing it with those Schwarzes? What do you mean sharing it with Muslims? What do you mean? And Schulweiss would say, you think I believe, does the bracha say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech Yisrael? It says melech Haolam is the God of all the world. You can't say, never again just for Jews, but Schwarzalach, that's not our problem. You can't say that. And it was very controversial. Very, very brave, by the way. Very because you're going right at the heart of where Jews live, where Jews' sensitivities. And this is where show is. Now, Billy, I've been putting you off, and I'm going to keep doing it. I love you, but I'm on a roll here, and you're not going to. A second answer was Yitz Greenberg, who was here a couple months ago. Remember Yitz? Yitz comes to this from a different place, right? Yitz also is totally affected by the Shoah. Lost many of his family members. And also believes, so for Yitz, a similar answer, but a different way to construct the argument. For Yitz, this is the great contest between life and death, which is what all of Judaism is about. And the Holocaust to Yitz is a revelatory moment, a moment of revelation. It tells us we have to be responsible. I mean, his language is really clear. He says, if God didn't intervene there, God's not going to intervene any place. You have to step up to responsibility. You have to step up to responsibility. Otherwise, nothing happens. The third answer we're going to learn today, which is David Hartman's answer. Hartman in 1970 goes to Israel. Hartman is an Orthodox rabbi from Brooklyn who has a beautiful pulpit in Montreal. And he goes to Israel in 1970. I don't know how many of you went to Israel after the Six-Day War. Anybody go to Israel after the Six-Day War? Live in Israel? There was this, how do you say it, euphoria? Is that good enough? There was this, oh, wow, feeling. It lasted until October 6, 1973. Then it crashed. But there was this, I remember, we went the summer of 70 also. Except Hartman went the summer of 70 and decided he wanted to live there. Because the story he told, he was walking Jerusalem after the Six-Day War. It's just, then he comes home to his congregation, and it was Tisha B'Av. It's an Orthodox shul. There's 500 people sitting on the floor of the shul, singing, Al Naharot Bavel, by the waters of Babylon we sat and we wept. And Hartman says, friends, guess what? It's ours. We own it. It's back. And they said, Shud, Reb David, be quiet, right? No, you don't understand. We own Jerusalem now. We control it. Reb David, shah, be quiet. We're davening, And he realized that there was a gap between the spiritual life of his congregation and the historical realities. And that became his task, to try to explain that gap. He made Aliyah to Israel and lived in Israel for the rest of his life, trying to explain that gap. So here we are. Today is the most interesting day of the Jewish year, because you're not only between Pesach and Shavuos, you're between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaTzmaut. And not only are you between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaTzmaut, you're between Yom HaShoah and the 70th Yom HaTzmaut. Right? This big birthday of Israel. Right? And not only are you between Yom HaShoah and the 70th Yom HaTzmaut, but last night we went to war in Syria. So what can I tell you? I have no idea. I have no idea. So this morning, what I wanted to do is to continue our conversation about a God of history. Billy's been waiting, and then you'll get to that. Billy, go ahead. You're a mensch for waiting so long.
Are the meaning of the two holidays tied to the specific days of the Omer that they
Okay,
fall?
say louder. What?
Are the meaning of the two holidays?
Which two holidays?
Yom HaShoah and Yom HaTzmaut tied to the days of the Omer?
No, not to. Well, yeah, because they're tied to Hebrew dates, and the days of the Omer are Hebrew dates.
Is there any meaning to that?
Yes. No. I don't know. Go, you figure it out. You're smarter than me. I mean, Yom HaAtzmaut happened to be the day that Ben Gurion announced the state of Israel. That's why it falls at that moment. And Yom HaShoah is the day of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Now, they could have chosen a different Yom HaShoah date. The real question is why they didn't assimilate Yom HaShoah into Tisha B'Av. That's the real question, right? And why Yom HaAtzmaut warrants a full holiday. I mean, we say Hallel in Shul. Let me try to translate that. There's a special section of extra prayers that are added on biblical festivals, Pesach, Shavuos, right? And we decided to say those prayers on Yom HaAtzmaut. I mean, think about that. It's the first holiday that's been added since Hanukkah. Hanukkah was added in the third century. There's a long time to go without a new holiday, right? You know, I mean, even the day the Cubs won the series wasn't. We don't say Hallel there, you know. Mark, welcome back.
It's good to be back. Look, last week I listened to this glorious recitation on your part of the role of God in history. And
wait for it, it's coming.
I said,
wait for it.
Not only am I not worthy to comment on such.
Wait for it.
But what can I say to someone who is completely and utterly wrong?
Let's all welcome Rabbi Gelman back to Torah study.
There's only two ways to examine history, and one is that it's dynamic and evolving, and the other is that it's static. The static way of looking at it fails because it doesn't understand that ideas have consequences and they move traditions into new, what Hegel called dialectics of human freedom. It means that we either look at the statements in Deuteronomy, the most primitive theology of Judaism, that God is going to give you rain in its season if you're good, and punish you with drought and defeat if you're not good. And we look at this, and you have to look all the way back to God's emerging understanding of God's relationship with people, that it isn't just the question of whether God will enter history or not. It's a question of what happens if God does enter history. And the idea is history can't sustain that. That's the point you've made. The Holocaust shows that God can't enter history because of such terrible evil. But there's a deeper problem.
Yeah.
The deeper problem is even if God could enter history, it would be totally destructive of what God initially intended to create in people, which is creatures with free will. If God enters history, and imagine this, and no one thinks this way, except my teacher Rubinstein when he taught me all this, was no one thinks like this. What would have happened if God had intervened in the Holocaust? What would have happened if God came down with lightning and plagues and destroyed Hitler and the whole Third Reich? Could we have, after that kind of theophany, that experience of God in history, could we have ever mounted human freedom to defeat the evils in the world? And his answer was, and he was totally right, and Harold knew it, and Yitz knew it too, which is no. We would sit on our asses, and we would say, good, God's in history, let God take care of it. Let God stop the rise of fascism here. Let God stop the chemical attacks. Let God feed the hungry in Biafra. And let God do that because God did it. God made a commitment to do it. And we're just ants. We're bees. We're worker bees in God's creation. And we've given up the only thing that makes us human, which is human freedom. Now, what Harold was trying to do, and what Yitz is trying to do, Harold more successfully, was to say, look, it is human freedom that shows us that God's in the world. But what they didn't see is that that understanding completely undermines, totally undermines, the idea that God intervenes in actual human history. It is as if to say, we, as Rubinstein said, we are here alone. We are not here alone in the sense that we have no guidance. That's what God gave us. That's where God evolves to. That God's best role for us is to give us guidance in how to use our freedom. God's worst option is the one we beat our breasts and say, why didn't God do this? God's worst option would have been to take our freedom away and take responsibility for moving history in the ways that God said. The greatest thinker who ever tried to synthesize those two ideas of human freedom and God's intervention was Hegel, and his notion of the Weltgeschichte, the world spirit, who would intervene in people like Caesar and Napoleon and others, who Weltgeschichte individuum, individuals who carried this spirit of the new kingdom in the world, even though they were unaware of it. But the solution here is profound and, dare I say, given all of the intellectual acrobatics of the Holocaust business, it is simple. And that is that there is a dynamic of human freedom that is the only gift that God gave us that matters. And the direction of human freedom is the Torah and its ethical guidance. But it is our freedom and our responsibility to do it. Is this God in the world? No. It's us. But it's us created by God to do this. Any model which includes rain in its season, if you're good, is a model that will collapse in the first drought. And that is what our entire tradition was about. Unfortunately, it requires embracing Wiesel's question, which is not where was God in the Holocaust, but where were we?
Oh, yeah.
I love you.
I was gonna, just for old time's sake, I was gonna say, Gelman, you ignorant sluts. You know?
Well, your favorite.
You are more than my favorite. Yes, please.
So there's practicality to the question of why Yom HaShoah is when it is,
Yeah,
as opposed to being on Tisha B'Av.
right.
And the answer that I heard recently was given by Rabbi Blau, who was the chief rabbi of Israel. who
Yeah.
says, if we commemorate Yom HaShoah on Tisha B'Av, people would be on vacation, wouldn't be in school, and it would be a teaching opportunity
Yeah.
for young children, at least in Israel.
Yeah. So the suggestion was made, I'll get back to Gelman in a minute, but the suggestion was made that the reason why Yom HaShoah is not celebrated on Tisha B'Av was offered by Rabbi Blau as the chief rabbi of Israel. Still the chief rabbi is a former chief rabbi. Former chief rabbi. Is that Tisha B'Av comes in the summertime when everybody's off of school. And we'd lose the teaching opportunity for children. That's a very practical answer, but I don't think that's really with respect to the great Rabbi Blau. I think it's much more involved with this question that Rabbi Gelman is raising for us, which is how do you construct, how do you absorb, what theology do you learn from these moments of our history? And because we're so close to these moments of our history, we're still not really sure. We're still not really sure. The Israelis, when they chose this date, chose the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising because they wanted it to make Yom HaShoah Ugvura. For them, the saving grace, that's a bad phrase, but it's the only one I could think of this day wasn't Holocaust rescuers as it was for Schulweis, but rather the Gvura, the fight of the ghetto fighters and the resistance movements in Europe, which showed that Jewish strength and pride were still there. We're going to take a look at that history in just a moment, because that's the Zionist, the beginning of the Zionist kind of ideas of history. Yeah, Bruce.
I don't want to let this go.
Yeah, no.
Because when I hear Rabbi Gelman talk, and
Yeah.
I hear you talk,
Yeah,
although at some level there's a disagreement, at another level there's not a disagreement. And if I close my eyes and think hard,
yeah,
I can see Yitz Greenberg in there too. Because
Yes.
Yitz Greenberg ties the whole thing into Tikkun Olam. He says,
Right.
in the modern age, God pulls God's self back,
right,
causing us an opportunity and an obligation to fix the world ourselves.
right.
And Rabbi Gelman, that's what I heard you say, and
Yeah.
that's what I heard you say too. So I'm curious about where the triangle between these three rabbis, whether there's whether there's a difference here.
No, there's not. There's not. I raised the question, and Rabbi Gelman answered the question. The problem is he answered the question 30 minutes too early. That's the problem. But basically, what we're suggesting here is, when you raise the question of, all right, what do I believe in now, right? These great post-Holocaust thinkers are the consensus among the ones, at least the ones that we like to read, is that you find, you interpret the presence of God in human responsibility. You'll find that in Schulweis, you'll find that in Hartman, you'll find that in Greenberg, you'll find that in Gelman, and many others. And that's one of the answers. That's one, not the only answer, by the way, but it's one of the answers. At least one of the, not answers, that's the wrong question, that's the wrong way to put it. It's one of the interpretive frameworks that you can use to sort of rescue religion, to rescue Judaism. But it requires, as the rabbi pointed out, a tremendous reinterpretation of the Jewish tradition. Let me show you, Pop, can you hang on 1 second? Or do you want to add something? Let me show you just a couple of examples of this, okay? Is that okay? So Chaim Hazaz is an Israeli writer. He made Aliyah to Israel in the 30s. His name wasn't Hazaz when he came. And he writes a very famous little short story called The Sermon. This is just a paragraph from it. And in this short story, a little Jew whose name is Yudke, and of course Yudke is the Russian derivative of Yehuda, which means Jew. He stands up at a kibbutz meeting, right? Now my pop is laughing because a kibbutz meeting is already a cultural event, right? The kibbutz was a socialist, Zionist, agricultural settlement, but really it was a huge dinner table where Jews argued. And once a week there'd be a kibbutz meeting. In 3 languages, right. They'd start out in Hebrew, and then they'd move to
Polish.
Yeah. No, first Hebrew, then they moved to Yiddish, and then to Polish and Russian.
That was the hard one.
Right. and the arguments at a kibbutz meeting would go on like late into the night because ideology at the beginning was very important. So Yudke shows up, and he's not one of the leaders of the kibbutz. Kibbutzim had leaders. Even though we're all equal, some kibbutz leaders are more equal than others, right? And they're the guys that would run the kibbutz and make the speeches. And this little schlepper gets up and he says, I want to make a statement. So the chairman says to him, okay, make your statement, but be quick about it, right? We want to watch soccer on the football on the television. He says, I want to say that I'm opposed to Jewish history. That's right. That's right. I will begin with the fact that we have no history at all. That's a fact. Because we didn't make our own history. The Goyim made it for us. Just as they used to put out our candles on Shabbos and milk our cows and light our ovens on Shabbos, so they made our history for us to suit themselves, and we took it from them as it came. They forced it on us whether we liked it or not. It's an interesting argument, right? Jewish history, we are not the subjects of our history, we're its objects. Right? We're not the subjects of our history, we're its objects. And because we're its objects, it's not a history that really belongs to us. Right? What's in it, he says? Oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom, and again, oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom. After that, it bores you to death. It's just plain dull. Our children love to read. Yes, they read, but historical novels about Goyim, not about Jews. And why is this? Because Jewish history is dull, uninteresting. It has no glory or action, no heroes or conquerors, no rulers or masters of their fate, just a collection of wounded, hunted, groaning, wailing wretches, always begging for mercy. I would simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them about their ancestors' shame? I would say to them, boys, from the day we were driven out from our land, we've been a people without a history. Class dismissed. Go out and play football. Wow. This is classical Zionism. This is classical Zionism, right? We like to think of Zionism in the state of Israel as the culmination, as it were, as part of the process of Jewish history. But you've got to remember that classical Zionism was a revolt against Jewish history. It was certainly a revolt against the way we read history. And by the way, some of you are Israelis, so you could verify this. In Israeli schools, you never learned history. You learned the Bible, and then you jumped to Herzl. Right? So everything from the end of the Tanakh to the beginning of the Zionist movement was like Nebuch. There wasn't anything there to learn. It was just boring.
In Mexico, Jewish schools was the same thing.
It's the history of Jewish victimhood, and that was nothing to be proud of. It's a rejection of our history, right? So listen to how he ends. And this is it's a much longer story. I just gave you a paragraph. To my mind, if I'm right, Zionism and Judaism are not the same. Not at all the same. But two things quite different from each other. And maybe even two things directly opposite to each other. At any rate, far from the same. When a man can no longer be a Jew, he becomes a Zionist. Right? When I can no longer stand the weakness of my people, the passivity, the victimhood, the narrative of victimhood, that's when you rise up and go to Israel and join a kibbutz, right? It's a rejection of the history, or at least the story of the history. So one of the ways to construct this, you see one of the ways to construct this? Think about this for just a moment, that Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaShoah are opposite each other. That Yom HaAtzmaut is the answer to Yom HaShoah. It's the rejection of Yom HaShoah. Like, that was then, this is now. That was then, this is now. That sense. Not just a rejection, by the way, of Yom HaShoah, but a rejection of the whole history. No more. I want no more of it. And that's a classical Zionist answer. That what you have here, I'll be right with you, what you have here is an infected people, and this is the only cure. This is the only cure. Which creates a very different way of reading Yom HaAtzmaut than most of us read it. Which we read it as the sort of culmination of Jewish history. Yes, Douglas.
You have to know the history to reject it.
Yeah.
2 generations later.
1 generation later, not 2. Because they did go out and play football.
You produce a level of ignoramuses that, that when they don't know the history, how do they have the context to do that?
Right.
And so, while the goal was admirable, the original founders who rejected the history,
right,
at least were stunted.
Right.
So then 2 generations later, you got what's the Shema? And it's like.
Yeah, the difficulty of being a revolutionary against your own history is that you teach your children a very different narrative than the one you learned. And then a generation later, you have a group of people who don't know what you revolted against. Right? Right? So you end up with a very interesting sort of a post-Zionist history, post-Zionist identity. Right? A post-Zionist identity which doesn't understand the meaning of the land of Israel or the state of Israel or the experiment of Israel because they don't know the history that led up to it. And they don't have a sense of peoplehood or connection. They have a sense of nationalism, but not a sense of peoplehood and connection, right? And that's sort of the history of the development of of Israeli identity. And then what happens in the mix? I'll give you one more chapter, then I can let you say one more thing, which is you get a second intifada, in which buses and cafes and restaurants and schools are blowing up all over Israel. And suddenly Israelis are faced with victimhood. And they taste a little bit of the vulnerability of diaspora Jewry. And what happens after the Second Intifada, which was 2001, is Israelis start turning back to their own history. Because they realize that they need to understand where were the sources of resilience of their ancestors when faced with the daily rhythm of evil. And so you have in Israel today a very different identity. A very, very different. This identity is being rejected, and a deep interest in that tradition. A deep interest in that tradition that came from before, because the notion that those people knew something about how to survive history that we don't know. And that's what's going on in Israel today. There's a real return to understanding the sources of Jewish history, the real return to Talmud. There's all these secular yeshivas in Israel. People who want to learn the Talmudic tradition. They want to learn the medieval tradition, partly because they want to understand this, what was the history that brought them there, but what was the sources of their resilience. Go ahead.
When I went to Yad Vashem,
Yeah.
I found it strangely unemotional. And largely because, I read all the time, and I didn't learn something new by going to that.
Yeah.
But what I did find very emotional was watching these, 18-year-old Israeli kids with their jaws dropping as they're walking through.
Right, but you got to know the history of Yad Vashem to know why that's interesting, okay? So we did this last week just a little bit, so forgive me. What you know now as Yad Vashem is the new Yad Vashem. It's the second Yad Vashem, son of Yad Vashem, okay? The old Yad Vashem was a very different museum. It was a long, low building, long, narrow building. And it had two walls, one wall on this side, one wall on this side. This wall told the story of the destruction of European Jewry. It was a diorama that, with pictures and other things, right? This wall was the story of Gevurah, of resistance. And the two walls were opposite each other and the same size. 6 million killed and several thousand involved because this wall, for Ben Gurion and his generation, for Yudke, redeemed that wall. You see? Now, what was missing was any of the testimony of the victims, because they were ashamed of the victims. Because the victims were weak, they were passive, they were impotent, they were this. They were the Jews we don't want to be. Holocaust survivors who made it to Israel wore long sleeves because they would be castigated, right? They were castigated, they were pushed away because they were the victims, and victims were not dignified. That's what Israel was. That's what this Israel was created to reject. The myth of victimhood. Okay, then comes the first Intifada. Then comes the second Intifada, and Israelis discover something. There are forms of resilience and resistance that they never never counted on. The new Yad Vashem. Right? You have those giant screens with people giving testimony about how they survived and what happened to them. Because they're looking for this resilience. How do I survive this constant rhythm of evil? And there's a whole new interest in Holocaust survivors. It's a very different story that's being told by someone should write this as a book. I mean, the two Yad Vashems and the difference between the story they tell. Okay? This is a different Israel. This is a different Israel because this is, first of all, it's a mature Israel. It's an Israel that's not based on rejecting anymore. This is rejection. It's an Israel based on affirming something. And one of the things it's affirming is the resilience it takes to survive. And there are forms of resilience. And resistance wasn't just taking up a gun and fighting against the Nazis. The resilience was the people in the concentration camps share their bread with each other. The mother who gave her ration of milk to her babies. The rabbi who kept teaching Torah, kept teaching bar mitzvah boys in the ghetto because he wouldn't let go of his faith. I mean, this kind of resilience, the Israelis would never, the old Zionists would never have understood. Now Israelis get it. You see, that's what you saw. That's what, to me, makes it so interesting. Okay? That's why you got to come to Israel with me next time. Right? Yes, more.
What about assimilation?
What about assimilation? Where does that come from? Yes. Well, I mean, another kind of assimilation. Another kind of resistance. If you say, "I just don't want any of this history altogether. I want to check out of this identity altogether." I don't want to worry about this stuff. I mean, part of this is there's a deep identification here with this history. That's what it's for.
It's an attraction of the culture.
Yeah. That's a different reason. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. That's a different reason for Israel. Papa.
There's a problem that's always been bothering me.
Yeah, always?
In the Talmud, Moses asked to see the reward of Rabbi Akiva.
Yeah.
And he sees him hanging in the mark and being flayed alive.
Right.
And he says, thus is his reward.
Yeah.
And God says, I have made my decision.
Yeah.
What are they saying?
All right, that's a very good question. So, I will. In the Talmud, in Talmud Menachot, there's a famous story. We've learned it together. The story is Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to get the Torah, right? Shavuos. And he sees God putting little decorations on the Torah. If you've ever seen a Sefer Torah, you know that the calligraphy has little decorations. Certain letters have these little crowns. They call them tagim or chukchikim, right? And he asks God, why are you doing that? And God says, because there's going to be a great scholar named Rabbi Akiva who's going to come and interpret a whole host of laws, even from the decorations. So Moshe says, let me see him. So God says, turn around, and he ends up in Akiva's academy. And he's listening to the discussion and he can't follow. He doesn't know what's going on. And finally, he's about to give up when one of the students says to Akiba, how do you know this? And Akiba says, it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. This is a halacha that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai, and Moses is happy. Okay? So now he goes back to God, and he says to God, that was the man's Torah. No, he says to God, you have a guy like Akiba, you gave the Torah through me? And God says, shtuk, shut up, that's my decision. So Moshe says, let me see his reward, a guy of such Torah. And he turns around, and he sees the body of Akiba hanging in the marketplace. Akiba was tortured to death by the Romans for the crime of teaching Torah. And Moshe goes back to God and says, Zo Torah v'zo schara. This is the man's Torah, and this is what happens to him? What kind of crazy universe are you running? And God says to him again, shtuk, shut up. That's my way. Okay? That's a very famous story. It's actually very much apropos, very much related to what we talked about. Because what does that story say? At a certain point in the development of our faith, the rabbis who were creating our Judaism made a decision that the extent of their freedom went to the interpretation of text. They could interpret Torah to say what they needed it to say. Akiba could twist and turn the Torah to make it say what he needs it to say. And God endorses that freedom. But when it comes to changing history, the events of our history, the conditions of our living, the rabbis became passive. And they said, that's in God's hands. We don't have a right to manipulate that. We give up on history. And the rabbinic strategy for surviving history was that we would be passive. We would not try to affect the conditions of our history. We would float. Remember that opening scene of Forrest Gump? And you see this little feather floating in there. That's us. We'll float on the surface of history and not attempt to control our own history. History is in God's hands. That's why every Seder ends with the words, L'shana ba b'Yerushalayim. Every Yom Kippur ends with the words, L'shana ba b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem, but we never went back. How come if we said that every year, we didn't go back? Now, you might say, because it was dangerous and it was difficult. And I'll say, let me tell you something. Poland was no picnic. We never went back. Why did we not go back? Because we were passive and God was the actor of history. We were bystanders, spectators. Our job was to wait patiently and live piously until God was ready to redeem us. And then God would reach into history and take his people and plant them in Eretz Yisrael to be ruled by King Messiah. That's what your ancestors believed. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema. I believe with perfect faith. B'vias HaMashiach, and the coming of Messiah. Ve'af al pi she'yitmamea. And even though it might take a while, 2,000 years, right? Af al pi, I will still believe. Ani ma'amin. Comes along the Zionist revolution and says what? Enough. The Zionist revolution was a rejection of that theory of history. Enough. Enough. We're not waiting any longer. That's what he's saying here. We refuse to be objects of history. We now choose to be its subjects. Enough. And if you'll come on Wednesday night, you'll understand that the irony of all this, that this movement was created and led by a Jew who didn't know enough Judaism to know that we couldn't do this. The guy was such an assimilated Jew. His name was Theodor Herzl. He was such an assimilated Jew that he actually thought that Israel was a place. Just think of that. For 2,000 years, Jews believed that Israel was a condition of being of the world, an era of history yet to come. Herzl didn't know that. He thought it was actually a place. Ha! Fool! And that we could actually go there. Which is why, at the turn of the century, most Jews were not Zionists. I mean, even on the day that the State of Israel was created, most Jews were not Zionists. Because Eastern European Jews were waiting for the Messiah. And Western European Jews were trying to assimilate as fast as they could. And nobody wanted Zionism, except a small group of crazy people like you. Right? Dov the baker of Barkai, a small group of young kids who rejected the Judaism of their parents. Not you, because your Bubby was a Zionist, but your grandfather rejected your grandfather's Yiddishkeit in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and said, I'm going to go build the state of Israel. This was a revolution. Let's take a moment and read Hartman, because I don't want to leave today without reading Hartman, because he has a different answer. He has an answer that you will find related to Rabbi Gelman's answer, but in a different manner. Because Hartman comes from a different world than Schulweis and a different world than Rabbi Gelman. Right? Schulweis was taught by Mordechai Kaplan. Rabbi Gelman was taught at HUC by Richard Rubenstein and by Atlas and by those teachers. Right? Glick, right?
By Nelson.
Nelson, right. David Hartman is Orthodox. David Hartman grows up in Brooklyn, studies at the Yeshiva Gedola in Lakewood, New Jersey. Rav Hutner was his Rav, right? David Hartman goes to Yeshiva University on a basketball scholarship. No, this is true. He went to YU on a basketball scholarship. He was a pretty good basketball player. Right? He used to play in the summer leagues in the, what?
Compared to the other Jews,
Well, David was my teacher. I spent a lot of time with him. He used to say he used to tell a story. He used to play in summer leagues in the Catskills. And once they played an exhibition game against the Boston Celtics. No, true. And he had to guard Bob Cousy. Now, if you don't know who Moshe Rabbeinu or Rambam is, that's okay. But if you don't know who Bob Cousy was, oh, you have the culture theory. Bob Cousy was this genius basketball player. And Hartman did better than Cousy. He bested Cousy in the game. And he used to brag about this his whole life. Anytime he had a chance to tell us that he once played against Cousy and beat him. And then one year, somebody told Bob Cousy that Hartman was saying this. And Cousy wrote a letter to some Jewish newspaper saying, yeah, I had the flu, But this was a story that those of us who learned with David would hear like over and over again. Yeah.
Just one comment, but going to City College, we had a lot more than one or two Jewish basketball players.
Yeah, no, there were Jewish basketball players. But Hartman goes to YU, to Yeshiva University, and he studies with a rabbinate, and his teacher is the great Rav Soloveitchik, with whom he broke from in a very difficult break. Because Soloveitchik, who's the greatest Orthodox rabbi of the late 20th century, really the leader of what we call today modern Orthodoxy. Soloveitchik's idea, and we've learned some of him before, Soloveitchik's idea was that religion is about defeat, about submitting to God. For Soloveitchik, the model of religion is the Akedah, it's the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. God says, this is what you do, and you say, I go. He took that from the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, the idea of giving up to God. Hartman is much more activist. And Hartman goes to Israel in 1970 and has a revelatory moment. He comes back, he packs up his family, moves to Israel, becomes a professor at the Hebrew University, and then goes on to found the Hartman Institute, where I studied. Yes, please.
Just go to point one thing out. Regarding Cousy having been beaten by
Yeah.
And Cousy claimed he had the flu?
Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Who was Cousy's doctor?
Yeah.
He didn't give him credit.
No. Hartman writes this. This was written in the late 80s, early 90s. I do not interpret current events in nature and history as direct expressions of God's will or design. I look exclusively to Torah and mitzvot as mediators of the personal God of the covenant. Now, here's what he means by that. From my perspective, the religious meaning one gives to events relates not to their origin, where they come from, but to their possible influence on the life of Torah. If an event in history can be a catalyst for a new perception of the scope of Torah, if it widens the range of halachic action and responsibility, if it provides greater opportunities for hearing God's mitzvot, then this already suffices to endow the event with religious significance, for it intensifies, widens the way God can be present in the daily life of the individual and the community. one can religiously embrace modern Israel, not through a judgment about God's actions in history, but through an understanding of the centrality of Israel for the fullest actualization of the world of mitzvot. All right, what does that mean? He says he doesn't see Israel as an expression of a God who reached into history and saved us. He doesn't believe in that kind of God, because that kind of God, if you believe in that kind of God, then you end up back where Rabbi Gelman says, so where is God in the Shoah? But he believes that, and this is from Maimonides, is where he gets this from, is that anything that expands the realm of Jewish life, that gives us a bigger realm of expression of Jewish life, becomes part of our sacred history. If you look just above this one, David Ben-Gurion, the first great prime minister and the leader of the Yishuv, had a very similar idea, where he says that only in the land of Israel can a person live a fully Jewish life. Because here in Encino, we can be Jewish in our private lives, but in our public lives, we have to be like everybody else. We have to be Americans. But in Israel, you're Jewish publicly and privately. So there's an integration of the individual, an integration of the human soul, of personality that happens in a Jewish space, in a Jewish country, because there's a Jewish public space. That's what all of us who live in America get all excited about when the grocery checker hands you your bag of groceries or your change and says Shabbat Shalom on a Friday night. Or when the television says Erev Tov Shabbat Shalom. You know, and you're like, oh my God, they just wish me Shabbat Shalom. Because there's no word for Saturday in Hebrew. After Friday comes Shabbat. Right? It's what all of us feel like when, every restaurant in Israel serves sufganiyot on Hanukkah. Right? When every place in Israel celebrates the Jewish holidays, there is a sense of inner and outer that's reconciled that we don't feel here in America. Right? I live in Encino. I don't know what the Jewish population is relative to, I know I live on Densmore, so I live in literally a ghetto, we let one non-Jewish family live here, so for affirmative action, right? It's our street. It's a very Jewish street, right? I mean, every one of my neighbors wishes me Shabbat Shalom as I'm walking to shul, right? None of them come to shul, but they all... I mean, Molly's here, so you get credit. You get big credit, But they're watering their lawns, they're playing football with their kids, and they wish me good Shabbos as I'm walking to shul. It's a machaya, right? Right? But so once my kids came to me one December and they say, Abba, how come we see these big Christmas decorations on Ventura Boulevard? Where's Hanukkah? And I had to sit my kids down and say to them, kids, we're 2% of the population. And they said, no, we're not. Everyone we know is Jewish. I mean, that's what happens when you raise children in Encino, But what he's talking about is a sort of healing of the inner and outer self. Hartman has a religious take on the same thing. If you can expand the realm of Torah, then that becomes by itself a holy expression. So let me go a little farther. I know you want to talk, but I want to get through this because it's late. Opportunities and risk alike owe their origin to the fact that the creation of the third Jewish Commonwealth, that's the modern state of Israel, confronts Judaism and the Jewish people with a new moral and political agenda, whose implications go beyond the strict geographic confines of the Jewish state. Now, I want you to pay attention to this, because this is very interesting. It's an opportunity and it's a risk. It's an opportunity and a risk. And pay attention to both, right? For a long time in history, we did not have to deal with questions that touch upon the relationship between halacha and political power, since we were a powerless community. See, when you're powerless, you can be a moral hero. I mean, sitting in my study at the end of the day, listen, I dream about being a tzaddik. Being a tzaddik's easy when it's all in your mind, when you can't actually do anything. But give somebody power, now you get to find out, are they really a tzaddik, right? Are they really a righteous person, right? Especially from the emancipation onward, Judaism was not involved in the public domain of power and politics. Judaism gave meaning to the individual. It taught Jews how to conduct their family life. It provided a framework for celebration of the holy. It provided a structure that kept alive the major historical moments that shaped the community's spiritual self-understanding. Judaism, however, did not have to deal with the agonizing moral questions that confront a nation that has military and political power. right? I mean, the crude expression of this is Ben-Gurion once said, we'll know that we have a real country when we have Jewish prostitutes and pickpockets. I've been to Tel Aviv. We have a real Jewish country, you know. But I mean, the idea that normal life, confront me with normal life, right? Right? It's easy. If halakha deals with the size of your sukkah or the kashrus of your pots, that's one thing. What happens when Jewish ethics are applied to the distribution of health care? What happens when Jewish ethics are applied to the distribution of income, poverty? What happens when Jewish ethics are applied to an army? To an army. There's this huge case in Israel just a couple of months ago about this young man who shot this terrorist. And the terrorist tried to kill people. They caught him before he did it. He was lying on the ground in handcuffs, and a kid went over and blew his head off. The kid was arrested, charged by military court, charged with murder. But there was a big thing in Israel about, well, the guy was a terrorist. Well, no, but you see the question, interesting question. What are the Jewish ethics? And how do you prosecute such a case? Right? How do you, even now, I mean, if you're a Jewish army protecting a border and there's a demonstration and they're burning tires and shooting at you, are you allowed to shoot live ammunition into that demonstration if you're not sure you're hitting bad guys? I mean, that's a Jewish question. That's a moral question. But you didn't have to deal with that when you were living in the ghetto because you didn't have a gun. Now that you have guns, you have to deal with a whole different set of issues. Power brings responsibility. And Hartman says this has opportunities and risks, but this is what makes Israel unique and holy in the course of Jewish history. This is the development, this is the God of history. I mean, God didn't give us this country, but we have an opportunity to bring God into this country. You see how that works? An opportunity to bring divine ethics into this country. A little farther. In the political sphere, our activity was limited to fight for the minority rights, religious tolerance, freedom of conscience in countries where we are oppressed or vulnerable minority. As a result of the rebirth of Israel, our political situation has dramatically changed. Amen. In Israel, religious and non-religious Jews have a new sense of power and belonging they've rarely felt throughout their long sojourn in the diaspora. Israel, however, not only gives expression to what is most noble in the Jewish tradition, gulp, it also readily exposes moral and spiritual inadequacies in the tradition. I don't know if you know this, but not all Jews are tzaddikim. You might not know this, because all Jews at VBS are. Here you find kindness and warmth and love and goodness, but you go out there, I mean, now that you have power, right? Israel therefore provides unique conditions for a serious critique of Judaism as it is practiced by committed halakhic Jews. He's Orthodox, so this is where he is. But I would take out the word halakha. I just think it's a serious critique of Judaism by serious Jews. Because there's a lot of schmutz in us. And now it becomes exposed. Hartman used to have a very funny statement. He said, you know, when we live where there are a lot of non-Jews, we tend to behave ourselves. We're polite, we wait in line, we wait our turn, we raise our hand, we speak in quiet voices. You take away the non-Jews, you know, he says that's the problem with Israel. It's like, you know, like your family's Seder, where everyone's just like after, you know. He says what Israel needs is a large dose of Presbyterians, you know. No, it's really true, because, you know, they don't wait in line, they don't raise their hands, they talk too loud, you know, they eat with their mouth open, right? How many of you have been to, you know, you don't have to go to Israel, by the way. Ventura Boulevard is good enough. I mean, you go to a Roma Cafe. You ever been to a Roma Cafe? I mean, first she gets the order wrong and then tells you it was your fault. And then tells you that what she brought you is better than what you ordered anyway. And then the guy behind you chimes in and says, no, that's my sister, so shut up. I mean, it's just like being in Israel. It's amazing. It's just wonderful. And on both ends, by the way, because if you say, boy, this is really good, she'll bring you seconds. Right? I mean, it's just like Israel. And now, you see, I don't know if the Tel Aviv girl is moving into Itzik HaGadol. And you tell me Messiah is far away. I'm telling you. Moral attitudes that one never expected to characterize Jewish behaviors can... This is his fancy way of saying this. See, David Hartman was one... There was the Hartman who spoke and the Hartman who wrote. The Hartman spoke is very free, and the Hartman was very constipated. That's what his word. He was very tight, right? Moral attitudes that one, in Israel, there's no external non-Jewish world to inhibit the tradition's full self-expression. Moral attitudes that one never expected to characterize Jewish behavior can surface in this uninhibited, passionate, and complex Jewish reality. All of our chauvinism, all of our racism, all of our bad habits now become exposed to the world. That's the great moral risk of re-entering history and taking power, right? Triumphalist nationalism, lack of tolerance for other faith communities, indifference, and often open disregard for liberal values of freedom of the individual, human dignity, and freedom of conscience can be found articulated by would-be religious leaders in Israeli society. This is the last line, is beautiful. A mature appreciation of our liberation struggle requires that we recognize the mixed blessings that freedom and power bring to Jewish living. So, whereas, let's go back where we were. So, for Yitz, he finds God in this moment of history in the human reaching for tikkun. For Harold Schulweis, it's in what we call godliness and the patterns of Jewish life patterns of moral life that we lead out, Jewish and moral life that we lead out, that's godliness. That's where God lives in the world. Hartman celebrates Yom HaAtzmaut as a yontif because for him it's the greatest example, it's the greatest opportunity to expand and deepen Jewish life, to have serious conversations about Jewish morality and Jewish life since the destruction of the temple in the year 70. It is this moment, a revelation moment, a moment when we can finally see something about ourselves, including the ugliness in ourselves. And therefore produces this marvelous moment of revelation. And for him, that's where God resides in this moment. That's where God resides in this moment. The question I want to ask you, and I'm going to leave with this, because this is going to be the question of the whole week. The question I want to ask you is why Israel? What is the significance? Many of us have a deep sense of loyalty, love, passion for the state of Israel. But if you have to turn to your teenage child or grandchild and the kid says, what do you mean homeland? I don't live there. What do you mean Jewish country? What makes it Jewish? Why is it important to you? Why is it important to you? Right? What is the answer to that question? What is it? And most of us will articulate something about what happened before. It's a place for Jews to run when Jews are in trouble. But I think that's a good answer for 1948. I'm not sure it's a good answer for 2018. Because right now, Jews in Israel are more threatened than Jews in America. So the question is, so going forward, what does this land mean to us? What does this expression of sovereignty mean to us? How do you understand it relative to Jewish history and to Jewish peoplehood? And the articulation of that answer is very important right now. Because kids, if you read all the polling, kids are kind of conflicted about why this matters to us. One of the ways that I try to at least locate ways of answering that question is to go back to the guys who first conceived of the whole state, which is what I gave you here, but we'll deal with this on Wednesday night. We talk about what Herzl thought and what Ahad Ha'am thought and what David Ben-Gurion thought, what Golda thought, Jabotinsky thought, because what they saw as the Jewish question. What was the Jewish question that Israel came to answer? And that, I think, is an important question for us to answer so we can answer it for our own kids. Have a very good Shabbos. Take care. Thanks once again. It was wonderful.
I love you. I'll be in New York doing your wedding next.
Oh, Mazel Tov. Good. Have a great time. Feel well.
Yeah.
Heal up. But take your time to heal. Yeah. I don't want you to hurting yourself, okay? Because you got to be careful. The other parts now get in trouble.
You were great.
No, good. Pop's now in the other place. He's back on Victory Boulevard. Hag Sameach, be well. How you doing? It's good to see you.
I will see you Monday.
Very nice.
At services. I'm assuming you'll be there for Barbara Lopati.
Yeah. I'm going to see them tomorrow morning.
Oh,
what a tragedy. Poor Ken.
So awful.
Yeah.
And I was just there for another dear friend of mine at Mount Sinai on Wednesday.
Right.